I'm Diane Whitlock, 57 years old, and I rose from a small military town to become a 4-star general and the senior American officer commanding an entire alliance in Europe. For 35 years, I mailed every promotion and every medal home to a father who never once called me a real soldier. But when a young lieutenant tried to throw me out of a NATO summit hall and my own security detail sealed every exit in the room around me, the truth I had spent my whole life trying to prove finally became impossible to ignore. Have you ever given everything to earn the respect of someone who refused to see you? If so, tell me your story in the comments. You are not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being underestimated, hit that like button and subscribe. The night before the second day of the summit, I stood at a hotel window 7 floors above a European capital and watched the motorcade stage in the rain. Black cars, blue lights, men in dark coats moving with the particular calm of people who have rehearsed an emergency 100 times. In the closet behind me hung a coat with 4 silver stars on each shoulder. I had spent 35 years earning those stars, and the one man whose opinion shaped my entire life had never once looked at them and seen a soldier. That is the strange arithmetic of my family. The higher I climbed, the smaller the story they told about me became. By the time I was given command of an alliance, my father had decided I was a woman who went to meetings in nicer rooms. I want to take you back to the house I grew up in, because you cannot understand the morning a lieutenant tried to throw me out of that hall unless you understand the kitchen table I learned to disappear at. My father, Lowell Whitlock, was a master sergeant in the United States Army. Infantry. He served 22 years, most of it with a rifle and a rucksack, and when he came home from his retirement ceremony in 1980, I was 11 years old, and I watched him hang a shadow box on the wall like a man hanging up a religion. Inside it were his stripes, his patches, a folded photograph of men I would never meet. He stood in front of it for a long time. Then he turned to the room and said the sentence that organized the rest of my childhood. "Anybody can wear a uniform, Diane," he said. "Only a few ever earn the dirt on it." I believed him. That was the trouble. I believed every word, and so when I decided to become a soldier myself, I measured my whole career against a standard built out of mud and a rifle, a standard that had no room in it for the things I would actually turn out to be good at. My mother, Carol, was the quiet one. Where my father measured, she kept. She kept report cards and ribbons and newspaper clippings in a shoebox she thought no one knew about. She was the counterweight in that house, and for most of my life she was the only person in it who acted as though my choices were worth witnessing. When I was 18, I sat down at the kitchen table and told my father I had signed up for Army ROTC. He did not look up from his coffee. He assumed it was a phase, a clever way to pay for college, the sort of thing a girl tried before she settled down. My younger brother Neil, who was 13 and already practicing our father's shrug, smirked into his cereal. It was my mother who followed me into the hallway afterward. She pressed a folded $20 bill into my hand as if it were a secret. "He'll come around," she said. "Until he does, you let me be proud enough for both of us." She had no idea how long she would have to hold that job. There is a memory I return to more than the others. When I was 9, before any of the hard years, my father taught me to shine boots at that same kitchen table. He showed me how to work the polish in slow circles, how to breathe on the leather and buff it until it threw the lamplight back like still water. He was patient in a way he almost never was, his big scarred hands guiding my small ones. And when we finished, he held one shined boot up to the bulb and turned it in the light and said, quietly, that it was good work. 2 words, good work. I cannot tell you how warm that kitchen felt in that moment. I have been chasing that lamp my whole life. I think that is the part people miss when they hear how my father treated me. It was not that he was cold all the way through, an easy villain you could dismiss. It was that he had shown me once, deliberately, exactly what his approval felt like, the precise temperature of it, and then spent the next 40 years deciding I had not earned it again. You do not ache for a thing you have never tasted. You shrug and you walk away. I could not walk away because I knew exactly what I was missing, down to the 2 words and the angle of the light. A child who has felt her father's pride once will spend a lifetime trying to feel it twice. I was commissioned a 2nd lieutenant in 1991, and I went to flight school because the Army decided I should fly, and it turned out I was made for it. I earned my wings, I learned to put a Black Hawk down in places where the air itself seemed to be working against me. The first time I set that aircraft into a hot landing zone in the Balkans, with the radios screaming and the dust swallowing the world, I understood something about myself that my father's creed had never left room for. I was calm where it counted. I was good at the thing that kept other people alive. I mailed every milestone home, the wings, the first command, the photographs, and every single time what came back was a single dismissive line, delivered as if it were a kindness. Flying, my father liked to say, was just bus driving in the sky. I remember standing in a hangar bay near a payphone, 26 years old, my flight suit still soaked through, calling home to tell him I had been recommended for captain ahead of my peers. There was a pause on the line. I could hear the television in the background, and then he said, when are you going to do something real? I want to be honest with you about that pause because I carried it for decades. I told myself I had stopped needing his approval somewhere around my second deployment. That was a lie I found very comfortable. The truth is that I built an entire career, partly as a 35-year-long argument addressed to a man who had already stopped listening. I rose because I was good, and because I refused to quit, and because somewhere along the way, the Army began to see in me exactly what my father refused to. But every promotion came with a phone call home, and every phone call home came with that same small erasure, and I learned to brace for it the way you brace for a step that is not there. People ask me now how a person becomes the senior military officer of an alliance. They expect a story about ambition. The truer story is about a girl at a kitchen table who decided that if she could just achieve the next thing, and the next, eventually the achievement would be loud enough that a quiet, stubborn man would finally have to hear it. He never did have to. That is the part nobody warns you about. You can be handed the keys to an entire theater of operations and still find yourself, at 57, standing at a rainy window the night before a summit, half listening for a voice from a kitchen in another country to tell you that you turned out to be a real soldier after all. I closed the curtain that night and laid out the coat with the 4 stars. I did not know that within 12 hours, a 24-year-old lieutenant would look at that coat and at me and decide I did not belong, and that in trying to remove me, he would set off the one thing my whole family had refused to do for 35 years. He would make the truth about me impossible to ignore. But I am getting ahead of myself. To understand how good it felt when that hall locked down around me, you first have to see how many years I spent being told the rooms I had earned were not really mine. The dismissal did not stay still as I rose. It evolved. That is the thing I have come to understand about the way some families decide who you are. The story does not update when the facts do. It just finds new and more creative ways to mean the same thing. In 2004, I came home on leave from Iraq. I had flown a recovery mission under fire that I will not describe in detail, except to say that men came home to their families because of decisions I made in about 9 seconds over a contested river. The Army gave me a Distinguished Flying Cross for it. I brought the case home and set it on the kitchen table, the same table, in front of my father. He looked at it the way you might look at a coupon. Then he asked me whether I had ever actually closed with the enemy, or whether I had just ferried the men who did. "Flying men to the fight isn't the same as being in it," he said. "You know that." I did know that. I knew it because he had taught it to me when I was 11, and he had updated the lesson just enough to make sure my newest achievement landed on the wrong side of his line. I had stopped expecting a parade by then. I had not stopped expecting him to read the citation. He never did read it. I found it years later in my mother's shoebox, the envelope still sealed, where she had rescued it from a drawer. I used to wonder why that citation stayed sealed in the drawer. For a long time I decided it was laziness, or stubbornness, or some refusal to read words that happened to praise me. My mother set me straight years later, and her version was worse and more human than anything I had imagined. She told me he had picked that envelope up more than once. She had watched him do it. He would carry it to his chair, turn it over in his big hands, hold it for a while, and then set it back down, unopened, and go do something else. She believed he was afraid of what reading it would do to the story he had spent 30 years telling himself. Because if the citation was true, then the woman who flew that recovery mission under fire was exactly the kind of soldier he claimed to respect above all others, and he would have to account for 3 decades of pretending she was something less. It was easier to leave the envelope sealed. It is always easier to leave the envelope sealed. I have come to believe that a great deal of what we call contempt is really just cowardice that has learned to dress well and speak in a firm voice. My father was not a cruel man. He was a frightened one who had decided that scorn was a more comfortable suit to wear in public than fear, and it took me most of my life to tell the difference. My brother Neil learned the trick and made it his own. When I pinned on colonel in 2013 and took command of a brigade, more than 3,000 soldiers, and a fleet of aircraft under my signature, I called home, and Neil answered. He congratulated me in a flat voice, and then I heard him turn away from the phone and say to someone in the room that his sister had just been promoted to head of scheduling. "Relax, it's a compliment," he said when I went quiet. "Somebody's got to run the calendar for all those generals." He was 39 years old. He had done a few years enlisted, never made it a career, and had spent the time since translating my life into something small enough to stand next to. I did not understand then that the joke was about him, not me. That understanding would take another 13 years and a magazine article to arrive. When I made Major General in 2020 and took command of a division, I invited my parents to the ceremony. My father did not come. He sent word through my mother that 2 stars was, in his estimation, a lot of meetings. My mother came alone. She flew across the country by herself, sat in the front row in a dress she had bought for the occasion, and afterward she took me aside and showed me the shoebox for the first time. 30 years of clippings, orders, photographs I did not know she had, a pressed program from my commissioning. "I couldn't make him come," she said, "but I wasn't going to let the day go unwitnessed." I held that box and I understood that one of my parents had been quietly keeping the truth about me safe for 3 decades, in a closet, waiting for the other one to be ready to look. He was not ready when I was promoted to general in 2025 and named Supreme Allied Commander Europe. That is the senior military command of the alliance, the post held by a single American officer who answers for the defense of an entire continent. It was on the national news. My father watched the clip. And then, my mother told me later, he turned to Neil and said it just meant Diane would be the one apologizing to politicians in nicer rooms now. 4 stars, the defense of a continent. And the story in that house was still that I had found a more comfortable chair from which to do nothing important. My mother called me the week of the summit. She lowered her voice so he would not hear her in the next room. She told me that he had watched my swearing in 3 separate times on the television. He had not said a single word about it. But, she said, he had not changed the channel either. He had just sat there, watching his daughter take the oath, in silence, again and again. I told her that was nice. I told her I had to go. I had a continent to look after and a summit to prepare for. And I had learned a long time ago not to build anything on the small movements of a man who would never finish the gesture. I should have known the gesture was closer than I thought, but I had spent so many years bracing for the step that was not there that I had stopped believing the floor could ever rise to meet me. The summit ran for 3 days. I will not pretend it was glamorous. It was long meetings and longer corridors, careful language and carefully timed coffee, the slow grinding work of keeping 32 nations pointed in the same direction. On the second morning, I came out of a closed bilateral meeting earlier than scheduled. The next session was not for 20 minutes, and I made a small decision that set everything in motion. I decided to walk to the main hall myself. My aide offered to bring the detail around. The proper way to move a 4-star at an event like that is in a small choreographed cluster, agents front and back, the path cleared ahead. But I had been talking and listening for 2 days straight, and I wanted 90 seconds of quiet before 1,000 cameras decided what my face meant. So I told my aide to bring the detail around the front and that I would meet them inside. I would take the service corridor. I would arrive at my own hall on my own feet, without a parade. I was in my service uniform. 4 stars on each shoulder, ribbons on my chest, my name nowhere a stranger could read it from across a hall. To a young officer who did not know my face, I was simply a woman in uniform, walking toward a restricted floor without an escort. I understand now exactly what Lieutenant Cole Ratliff saw. At the time, I only knew that a young man had stepped directly into my path. He was 24. A first lieutenant, 1 silver bar, the kind of brand new that still creases. He had a clipboard and a lanyard and the particular rigidity of someone who has been told the most important thing he can do today is keep the wrong people out. He had been posted at the principal's entrance, and he had been handed a list, and his list was wrong. None of that was his fault. What happened next was "This floor is for principals only, ma'am," he said. "You need to leave." I have given and received a great many orders in my life. I know the difference between a soldier executing a task and a soldier defending his ego. In that first sentence, he was still doing his job. So I did mine. I stayed calm, I gave him my name and my appointment, and I asked him to check his list again. He did not check his list. That was the moment it turned. He looked at me, decided I was bluffing, decided that a woman claiming to be the Supreme Allied Commander was exactly the kind of problem he had been posted to remove. And he repeated himself with an edge in his voice. "I won't ask twice," he said. I want you to understand that I was not angry. I was somewhere stranger than angry, because I had heard that exact tone before. At a kitchen table, in a hangar, on a dozen phone calls. He had a job and a bad list, and somewhere between the two, he had decided I did not belong in the room I had spent 35 years earning. He was a stranger, doing in 10 seconds what my family had done for 3.5 decades. I opened my mouth to give him one more chance to look down at the clipboard. I never got the words out. Behind him, a staff door opened. What I had not accounted for, in my small wish for 90 seconds of quiet, was that my personal security detail does not actually let me walk off alone. They had been shadowing the corridor the entire time. Major Holt Brennan, the officer who runs my detail, had been reading the scene from 30 feet away, and the instant he saw a principal being physically blocked and a voice being raised, he stopped seeing a misunderstanding and started seeing a security event. He moved, and when he moved, the whole architecture of the room moved with him. Agents stepped to the doorways. I heard the sound before I understood it. A series of solid, mechanical clicks running around the perimeter of the hall as every exit was secured, one after another, by people whose entire job is to seal a space around the person they are protecting. The delegates nearest the doors went quiet and still. A ripple of confusion, then recognition, moved through the room. I had time, in those few strange seconds, to notice small things with great clarity, the way you do when adrenaline slows the world down. A foreign minister near the dais set his coffee cup down with enormous care, as though a sudden noise might make everything worse. A young aide pressed herself flat against a marble pillar and went still. 2 senior officers from another nation's delegation, men who had never met me and did not know my name, turned toward the commotion and read the entire situation in a single sweep of the eyes, the way soldiers read a room, and they came to attention before anyone had told them a thing. That was the detail that stayed with me. They did not straighten because they recognized my face. They straightened because their bodies recognized the shape of a protective detail sealing a hall around a principal, and some deep trained instinct answered it before their minds had caught up. That is the thing Lieutenant Ratliff had not yet learned, the thing it would take him years to learn. Rank is not the bars on your collar or the stars on your shoulder. Those are just the receipt. The real thing is the way a room reorganizes itself, the way trained people orient, the way the air itself seems to change when actual authority walks through a door. You cannot fake it, and you cannot bluff your way past it, and a clipboard is no defense against it at all. And Lieutenant Ratliff, who had been so certain that my claim would collapse the moment he pushed on it, stood frozen as the hall locked down around the very woman he had just ordered to leave. I watched the boy's certainty drain out of his face, one exit at a time. Major Brennan crossed the last few feet and stepped to my shoulder. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. He faced the lieutenant and he said the words that rearranged the young man's entire morning. "Saucer is secure. Stand down, Lieutenant. This is General Whitlock." I watched Ratliff's eyes drop to the clipboard at last. I watched him find the line he had skipped, the line with my name and my title on it. And I watched him understand that he had come within one sentence of laying hands on the highest-ranking officer in the building. The blood left his face. The senior delegates closest to the door had come to attention out of pure reflex. For one long second, the boy looked like he wanted the sealed floor to open and take him. I have been underestimated my whole life. I had never once watched it happen this fast, or this completely, in front of this many people. And the strangest thing, the thing I did not expect, was that I felt no urge to enjoy it. I raised one hand to hold the room. "Everyone as you were," I said. "Open the doors. Lieutenant, walk with me." The exits unlocked one after another, the same sound in reverse, and the room let out its breath. And a 24-year-old officer who had been an instant from dragging a general out by the arm fell into step beside me, white as paper, waiting to learn how the worst morning of his career was going to end. I have watched a lot of young officers brace for the end of a career. There is a specific stillness that comes over them, a held breath that can last for hours. Lieutenant Ratliff had it badly. I took him into a small side office off the hall, sat him down and let the silence work for a moment while I decided what kind of commander I wanted to be in front of a frightened 24-year-old. The easy thing would have been to hand him to his chain of command and let the machine do what the machine does. He had blocked a principle. He had raised his voice. He had refused to verify when verification was the entire point of his post. By the strict letter of it, he had earned every consequence that was now circling him like weather. But I asked for his clipboard, and there it was, an incomplete principals roster, a version that had clearly not been updated with the second-day movements with no supervising officer's name anywhere on it. He had been posted at one of the most sensitive doors in Europe, handed a defective list, and left alone. The failure that put him in my path was not really his. It belonged to 3 people above him who were not standing in that office. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "I'd rather you just report me than be kind about it. I earned the report." "You earned a correction," I told him. "Reports are for people who won't take one. Are you a man who won't take one?" He shook his head. I believed him. I have thought a great deal since that morning about why I did not simply let the machine have him. Part of it was the roster, the plain injustice of marking a young officer for a failure his seniors had built and then walked away from. But part of it was older and more personal than fairness. I knew exactly what it felt like to be judged in a single glance by someone who had already decided who I was before I opened my mouth. I had been on the receiving end of that particular look my entire life, at kitchen tables and on telephones and in more rooms than I could count. And here, for once, the authority to do it to someone else was sitting in my hands, warm and available, and completely justified by the rules. I could have ended that boy's career with one sentence, and no one would have questioned me for it. That, I have come to think, is the real test. Not what you do when you are powerless, but what you do in the exact moment you finally hold the power to pass your own wound along to someone smaller than you. The whole point of surviving contempt, if it is to mean anything at all, is that you learn to break the chain instead of extending it. If I crushed him, I would only be teaching him that crushing is what authority is for. I had been taught that lesson myself for 35 years. I had no intention of teaching it again. Outside Major Brennan was still running hot. The lockdown had spun his whole detail up, and his instinct, a good one, was to see the incident documented and the lieutenant's chain notified formally, today, in writing. He met me in the corridor and made his case. "Ma'am, with respect, he put hands a foot away from a principal," Brennan said. "That goes in a report." "Then write the part that's true," I said. He followed a bad list nobody checked. "Start there. I want the roster process fixed before I want a young officer's career marked for somebody else's failure." Brennan did not love it. But he was a professional, and he heard the order inside the disagreement, and he went to fix the roster. That night in my hotel room, I did something I had not done in a long time. I called Ivy Coleman. Ivy and I went through ROTC together a lifetime ago. She made Brigadier General, retired a few years back, and she is the only person left alive who knew me before there was any rank on me at all. She is the one person I can call and be a person with, instead of a position. I told her about the lieutenant. I told it as a funny story, the way you do, the green kid and the clipboard, and the comedy of a whole hall locking down around me. And then, somewhere in the middle of telling it, it stopped being funny, and I had to stop talking. "What is it?" she asked. "He sounded like my father," I said. Ivy was quiet for a second. She has known my father for 40 years. "A stranger looked at 4 stars and saw a woman in the wrong place," she said gently. "Tell me that's new to you." It was not new. That was the whole problem. A boy I had never met had looked at the most senior rank in my service and concluded I did not belong. And his certainty had the exact texture of every phone call I had ever made home. Ivy did not have to say my father's name. We both heard it sitting there in the quiet on the line. I went and stood at the window again. Same rain, second night. And I finally let myself see the shape of the thing I had been doing for 35 years. I had been collecting proof, wings, citations, commands, stars, an entire alliance, all of it gathered like evidence for a trial in front of a judge of one who refused to take his seat. The day before, the architecture of a summit hall had confirmed who I was so emphatically that grown diplomats came to attention, and I had still gone back to my room and somewhere underneath everything, listened for a voice from a kitchen to tell me it counted. I was done. Not done with my father. I would never be done with my father. But done performing for a verdict he had spent 4 decades refusing to deliver. I took out a note card and I wrote one line on it. And I want to tell you that I wrote it to myself and not to him, because that distinction was the entire point. The work was always enough. Act like you believe it. I propped the card against the lamp. Then I went to bed in a foreign city, the commander of a continent's defense, a 57-year-old woman who had just finally fired the judge. A decision is only real when it costs you something. Over the next 2 weeks, mine cost me on 2 fronts at once. And I want to walk you through both, because the public one and the private one turned out to be the same decision wearing different clothes. The public one was Lieutenant Ratliff. Before I left the summit, I signed off on a corrected access control procedure, the kind of dry, unglamorous fix that actually prevents the next incident. And then I did the thing that surprised my own staff. I personally requested that Ratliff be retained and mentored rather than flagged. I asked that he be assigned a standard to meet and a senior officer to answer to, and I told them I wanted to know in 90 days whether he had met it. I called him in before I flew out. He stood at attention, like a man at his own sentencing. I'm not protecting you because you were right, I told him. You were not right. I'm investing in you because you can be. Do not make me regret the difference. Something moved in his face that I recognized. It was the look of a young person being given a second chance by someone who had every reason not to bother. I had worn that look once myself, decades earlier, when a captain I had disappointed chose to teach me instead of bury me. The Army runs on that quiet inheritance, the choice to spend your authority building someone instead of breaking them. I was just passing down what had been handed to me. The private cost came in 2 phone calls. For years there had been a defense reporter who wanted to write a long profile of me. I had always declined. I told myself it was because self-promotion was unseemly. But the truth I finally admitted that week was uglier and smaller. I had been declining the profile to spare a man who never spared me. I did not want to give my father something printed and public to roll his eyes at. I had been managing his contempt for so long that I was censoring my own life to keep from provoking it. So I said yes. On my terms, about the work and not about me, but yes. The public record should exist, I decided, whether or not the one man it was secretly addressed to ever chose to read it. Then I called home. My father answered. I told him I loved him, which I did not say often, and I told him plainly that I was finished waiting for him to call me a soldier. I did not yell. I was not cruel. I simply set the thing down between us after 35 years of carrying it, and he heard it as an attack. So now I'm the villain, he said, because I raised you to be tough. No, I said. You're the man I stopped trying to convince. That's not the same thing. He did not have an answer for that. My mother took the phone. We talked for a few minutes about nothing, the weather, her garden, the careful, small things she uses to hold a family together. And then I hung up. An hour later, Neil called. He was annoyed. I had upset the old man, he said. I should call back and smooth it over. It was easier on everyone when I just let it go. He's 82, Diane, Neil said. Why do this now? Because I've been letting it go since I was 11, I told him. I'm not asking him to change. I'm telling you both I'm done auditioning. You can be upset about that. I'm still done. Neil pushed. I held. And when I hung up that second call, I noticed my hands were steady. For most of my adult life, a call home left me rattled for an hour, replaying it, managing the ache. This time there was no ache to manage. There was only a clean, quiet relief. The feeling of setting down a rucksack you have carried so long you forgot it was optional. My staff noticed the change before I ever explained it to anyone. I was lighter in meetings that week, quicker to laugh, less armored against the room. One of my aides, a sharp young major who had worked at my side for 2 years and missed very little, finally asked me carefully whether something good had happened at home. I told her the truth, which surprised both of us. I told her that nothing had happened at home at all. The thing that had changed had happened inside me, alone, in a hotel room, the night I stopped waiting for a verdict that was never going to be delivered. She nodded slowly, the way good young officers do when they're filing something away for a later they cannot yet imagine. And I found myself hoping very much that she would remember it sooner in her own life than I had remembered it in mine. Because we spend so long auditioning for the people who have already decided not to clap. We perfect the performance, we refine it year after year. We promise ourselves the next show will be the one that finally moves them. And the freedom, when it comes at last, is never in earning the applause. It is in the simple, almost embarrassing realization that you were always allowed to walk off the stage, and that the people worth performing for were never the ones withholding the sound. I did not know it yet, but the words I had refused to keep censoring were about to travel home without me. The profile I had finally agreed to was already being written, and the truth about who I was, the truth my family had spent 35 years shrinking, was about to arrive on their doorstep in a form none of them could shrink, because for once it would not be in my voice. The article ran in the middle of May. I had given the reporter a few hours over 2 days, mostly about the alliance, the work, the people I serve with. I had braced for it to feel like exposure. Instead, it felt like the truth, standing up in a courtroom and speaking in a voice that was not mine, and therefore could not be dismissed as mine. The reporter opened the piece of all things with the lieutenant. He had heard about the incident at the summit, and he led with it, but he flipped it. In his telling, it was not a story about a young officer's mistake. It was a story about a woman so senior that when a stranger tried to remove her, the physical architecture of an international summit reorganized itself to protect her, and a continent's worth of diplomats came to attention. A stranger had said out loud what my family said in private, and this time it was written down, with my title under it, for anyone to read. The article explained, in plain language a civilian could follow, exactly what the Supreme Allied Commander Europe does. It described the scope of it. It quoted a counterpart from another nation, calling me the most trusted commander at the table. It laid my 35 years out end to end, the flying, the deployments, the commands, the decisions, and it did the one thing my family had never allowed the facts to do. It let them add up. It reached the town I grew up in the way these things do, sideways, through other people. Neil read it first. A coworker forwarded it to him, not knowing the general in the headline was the sister Neil had spent years reducing to a punchline about scheduling. He told me later that he read it standing up in his kitchen and had to sit down. He got to the line about the most trusted commander at the table, and something in him simply gave way. "I've been telling people for years she runs meetings," he said to his wife, the article shaking a little in his hand. "She runs the meetings that decide whether there's a war." He did not call me that day. He needed to sit with it. I understand that now. Some certainties are load-bearing, and when they go, you have to wait for the dust to settle before you can walk around in the new shape of things. My father read it because my mother made sure he would. She did not hand it to him or make a speech. She simply printed it out, set it on the kitchen table where he took his coffee, and walked away. She had been planting seeds in that man's silence for 40 years. She knew exactly how to let one grow. He read it twice. She told me that later. He sat at the table and read the whole thing through, and then he went back to the top and read it again, and he did not say a word. And then my mother could not find him for a while, and she went looking, and she found him in the garage. He was standing at his workbench under the one bare bulb, holding his own shadow box. 22 years of an army life, his stripes, his patches, the folded photograph of the men he served with. He was holding it in both hands and looking at it, and on the bench in front of him was the printed article, with my 4 stars in the photograph and my title under my name. My mother stood in the doorway and watched her husband hold his entire career in his hands and measure it, for the first time, against his daughters. She did not interrupt him. She told me she just watched because in 40 years she had never seen him not argue with something. She told me later that she almost spoke. She almost crossed that garage and put her hand on his shoulder and said something soft, the way you want to when you love someone and you can see them hurting. She did not do it. She had spent 40 years learning the difference between the silences that need filling and the silences that need protecting. And she knew, with the certainty of long practice, that this one was the second kind. Whatever was finally happening inside that stubborn old man was happening for the very first time, and it was fragile, and it would not have survived being interrupted by even the gentlest hand. So she turned around, she went back into the kitchen and put the kettle on and let him stand alone under the bare bulb with 22 years of his own service in one hand and 35 years of his daughter's in the other. She had waited 3.5 decades for him to pick that article up, She could wait another hour, she decided, for him to set it down. That is its own kind of love. The kind that knows when to leave a man alone with the truth. My mother had been practicing it in the next room my whole life. He didn't argue with it, Diane, she said when she called me. I've never seen him not argue with something. He just read it and then he went out to the garage and he's been quiet ever since. Not angry quiet, the other kind. I asked her what the other kind was. She was quiet herself for a moment. The kind a man gets, she said, when he finally runs out of reasons not to see something that was in front of him the whole time. There was no grand apology. I want to be careful here, because the easy version of this story would have my father weep and beg my forgiveness. And that is not what happened, and I am glad it is not, because it would not have been him. What happened was slower and truer, and it came in pieces, each one earned. Neil moved first. His dismissal had always been the lighter one, a younger brother's defensive habit rather than a father's whole creed, and so it was easier for him to set down. He called me about a week after the article ran. I expected him to defend our father, the way he always had. Instead, he apologized for himself. I made you small so I'd feel bigger, he said. He did not soften it or explain it away. That's the whole reason, Diane. Every joke about scheduling, the whole bit. I did it because you were doing something with your life that made me feel like I hadn't done anything with mine. That's on me. I'm sorry. I had waited a long time to hear something that honest from anyone in my family. I told him so. Thank you for saying the true version, I said. That's all I ever wanted from anyone in this family. Not the apology. The truth. A few days later, a handwritten letter arrived from Lieutenant Ratliff. He had passed the 90-day standard early. He wrote to tell me and to ask my permission for something. He wanted to be allowed to tell the story, his version, to his own soldiers, as a lesson. Ma'am, he wrote, I tell my platoon the most dangerous thing I ever did was assume I already knew who was in front of me. I read that line 3 times. A 24-year-old had taken the worst morning of his career and turned it into the one thing I had spent 35 years wishing my own family could learn. I gave him my permission gladly, and then my father called me himself. Not through my mother, himself. For the first time in more years than I can count, my phone rang, and it was him. He did not apologize. I had not expected him to, and in a way I did not want him to, not yet. Because an apology would have been a way of closing the subject, and he was not closing it. He was opening it. I'm not calling to say I was wrong, he said in that gravel voice I had braced against my entire life. I'm calling because I read that article, and I realized I never once asked you what you do. In 35 years, I never asked. So, tell me. So I told him, soldier to soldier, the way he could hear it. I told him what it means to be responsible for the defense of a continent, what a day looks like, what keeps me up at night, what the work actually costs. I did not defend it. I did not perform it. I just answered the question he had, finally, at 82, decided to ask. And he listened. He did not interrupt once. For a man who had spent 4 decades talking over my life, the sound of him simply listening was the loudest thing I had ever heard him do. We stayed on the telephone for nearly an hour, which we had not done in my entire adult life. At one point, he asked me a question so specific and so genuinely curious about how a single American officer comes to command soldiers from 30 other nations who do not even share a language, that I had to stop and laugh out loud, because it was exactly the kind of question a sharp young lieutenant asks, and here was my 82-year-old father asking it of me with the same hungry attention. For one strange and lovely stretch of that call, the rank fell away from both of us, and the history fell away with it, and we were simply 2 soldiers from 2 different eras, comparing the only thing we had ever truly had in common, which was the work itself. He asked about logistics. He asked how you hold men's trust across a language barrier. He asked the questions of a professional, and he listened to the answers like one. I had spent my entire life wanting my father to approve of my service, lying awake as a young officer, composing arguments in its defense. I had never once, in all those years, imagined that he might simply be interested in it. An interest, I learned that night, is the rarer thing and the kinder one. Approval is a verdict handed down from above. Interest is a hand reaching across to meet you where you stand. At the end of it, I set my terms. I told him I would come home for a visit. But I told him the condition. I would come as exactly what I am. No shrinking and no performing, no managing his contempt and no auditioning for his approval. if he could let me be a general and his daughter at the same time, I would get on a plane. My mother, in the background, agreed before he could. And then my father, gruff and graceless and trying, said, "All right, come home then." It was not poetry. From him, it was everything. I booked the flight that night, and for the first time in my adult life, I booked a trip home without the old knot tightening in my stomach, because for once I was not going home to prove anything. I was just going home. I flew home in the last week of May. I rented a car at the airport and drove the last hour myself, the way I used to, and the road took me past all the old landmarks of a life I had spent mailing back to people who would not open the envelopes. It took me past the regional airfield where, 31 years earlier, a soaked 26-year-old had stood at a payphone and heard her father ask when she was going to do something real. Every mile of that road was a milestone I had mailed home and never seen opened. I drove past all of them, and for the first time they did not ache. They were just places now. The house was smaller than I remembered. They always are. My mother met me at the door and held on too long, the way she does. My father stood behind her in the hallway, 82 years old, slower than the man in my memory, and he put out his hand and shook mine. And neither of us knew what to do with the size of the moment, so we let the handshake be enough for now. That first night we sat at the kitchen table, the same table. I am telling you, that table has witnessed every important thing that ever happened in my family. And most of them were unkind, and I felt all of them in the grain of it when I sat down. But the evening was different. Neil started to make a joke, an old reflex, a crack about generals and chauffeurs, and I watched him catch it in his own mouth and put it back. "I was going to say something dumb," he said, half to himself. "I'm going to not do that now." We laughed. It was the first time I could remember my family laughing with me instead of at the cost of me. Later, my father took me out to the garage. He showed me his shadow box, and this time it was not a lecture, the way it had been when I was 11. This time he showed it to me as one soldier, showing another the thing he was proudest of. Looking for my eyes on it, wanting me to see. And then he said, the thing I had waited my whole life to hear, without ever knowing it was the thing underneath all the other things. "I called it soft because I was scared it'd be hard," he said. He was not looking at me. He was looking at his stripes under the bulb. "I came up in an army that chewed men up and spit them out, and I watched it happen to better soldiers than me. When you signed up, all I could think was that I didn't want them to do to you what they did to me. So I called it soft. I told myself if I made it sound like nothing, maybe you'd quit before it could cost you anything." He finally looked at me. "That's not an excuse. It's just the truth I owe you. I was never ashamed of you, Diane. I was scared for you." And I let the scared come out of my mouth as scorn for 35 years. I did not know what to say. 40 years of a closed door, and behind it, all along, not contempt, but fear wearing contempt's clothes. It did not erase the 35 years, but it explained them, and there's a kind of peace in finally being given the true map of a country you spent your whole life lost in. We stood in that garage for a long time, without saying a great deal more. He took the photographs out of the shadow box, one by one, and told me the names that went with the faces, men I had heard about my whole childhood as distant legends, and was only now hearing about as friends he had loved and buried and missed every day since. A young man named Doyle who had once carried him half a mile under a load no one should have been able to lift. A sergeant he had served under who never came home. He told me their stories in the low, even voice of a man finally setting something down after carrying it too long. And I realized, standing there under that buzzing bulb, that I was meeting my father for the first time at 82 years old. Not the master sergeant, not the creed, not the closed door, not the firm voice that had measured me and found me wanting for 35 years. The actual man underneath all of it. The one who had been so frightened for his daughter that he had never found a language for it except scorn. We had wasted so much time, he and I, more than most people are ever given in total. But we were not wasting this, and there is a particular and unexpected grace in being handed even a small, late portion of a thing you had long ago stopped letting yourself want. I took the portion. I did not waste a second of it counting what we had lost. That night I came down for a glass of water and the garage light was on again. I looked out and saw my father standing at his bench in his old service cap, and he was lifting his right hand slowly toward his brow, and then dropping it and lifting it again, practicing. When he saw me in the window, he stopped, embarrassed, like a boy caught at something. I went out. I asked him what he was doing. He would not quite meet my eye. "Not yet," he said. "I want to do it right." And he turned back to the bench, and I understood that something was coming and that he needed to be the one to decide when, and that the most loving thing I could do was let him. My last evening home, the family gathered in the backyard. Neil grilled and burned half of it, and we ate it anyway. My mother brought out the shoebox, the one she had hidden for 30 years, and set it in the middle of the picnic table in the daylight, and for the first time nobody was embarrassed by it. We passed the clippings around. My father read a few of them out loud, slowly, in his gravel voice, the citations he had refused to read when they were new, and this time he read them all the way to the end. 30 years I hid this box, my mother said, laughing and wiping her eyes at the same time. Tonight I'm putting it on the table where it belongs. It was a good evening. I want you to know that because so much of this story has been about the cold years, and I do not want you to miss the warmth when it finally came. We were not a perfect family, repaired and gleaming. We were a real one, late and trying and human, and that is so much better than perfect. When it was time to leave for the airport, I went to gather my things and I came back to the front hall and my father was waiting for me by the door. He had put on his old service cap. He was standing as straight as an 82-year-old body will allow, which was straighter than I would have believed, and the moment I came around the corner, I understood what was about to happen, and I stopped breathing. He brought his right hand up to the brim of that cap in a slow, deliberate, perfect salute. And he held it. His arm trembled with the effort and the years, but he held it, his eyes locked on mine, a master sergeant rendering honors to a general who was also his little girl. Master Sergeant Whitlock, United States Army, retired, he said, and his voice was not entirely steady. Reporting that I am proud of you, General, about 40 years late. I have received a great many salutes. I will receive a great many more. I will remember exactly one of them on the day I die, and it is that one, in a front hallway, from an old man in a service cap who had finally run out of reasons not to lift his hand. I returned it. I held it the way you were supposed to, crisp and correct, soldier to soldier. And then I broke it, and I crossed the hall, and I put my arms around my father, and the two of us stood there holding on, while my mother cried in the doorway, and my brother pretended very hard that he was not. Neil drove me to the airport the next morning. About halfway there, he pulled the car over onto the shoulder, which alarmed me, and then he just sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel and the engine running and told me, without looking at me, that he was going to do better. Not in a dramatic way, he said. He did not want a big scene or a clean slate or my forgiveness handed over in a bow. He just wanted me to know that, steadily, from here forward, he was going to be different. He told me he had spent his whole life standing in the shadow he believed I cast over him, and resenting me for the shade, and that the article had finally made him see that the shadow was never something I had done to him. It was something he had chosen to stand in, because it was easier to be cold in my shade than to go stand in his own sunlight and find out what he could grow there. He was going to step out of it now, he said. I told him I had never once wanted him in any shadow, that there had been sunlight enough for the both of us the entire time, and that I had spent my own life wishing he would step into it beside me. He nodded. He wiped his face with the back of his hand and pretended he had not. Then he put the car back in gear, and we drove the rest of the way to the airport as something much closer to what a brother and a sister are supposed to be. He held that salute until his arm shook. I had waited my whole life to return it, and the strange thing, the thing I never could have predicted, was that I no longer needed it. I just wanted it. The needing had burned off somewhere over a sealed summit hall and a quiet hotel room and a note card against a lamp. What was left, standing in that hallway, was not a debt being paid. It was a gift being given, and a gift is a far better thing than a debt. I flew back to my command the next morning. I put the uniform back on, the coat with the 4 stars on each shoulder, and I want to tell you the strangest part of all. The stars felt exactly the same as they had always felt. Not heavier with my father's approval, not lighter for having waited. Exactly the same. Because they were never the thing that had been missing. The work had always been enough. I had just spent 35 years refusing to let myself believe it while I waited for a hand to come up to a brow. I sat at the gate that morning, a 57-year-old woman in a general's uniform, and I thought about the lieutenant at the summit. the boy who looked at everything I am and saw someone who did not belong. I do not resent him anymore. In a strange way, I am grateful to him. He locked a room around the truth so loudly that it finally traveled all the way home. So let me say this to you. Whoever you are, however you found this, if you are still out there trying to earn a salute from someone who will not give it, hear me. Collect your proof if you must. Climb if you must. But do not wait at the gate of your own life for someone else's hand to rise. The work was always enough. The day you believe, that is the day you get your life back, with or without their hand at their brow. Mine came up, in the end, in a front hallway, 40 years late. And it was beautiful. But I had already gotten my life back the night before, at a window with a note card, when I finally decided to believe the thing I had known and refused all along. The plane lifted off over the small town and the smaller house, and somewhere down there, my father was probably already back in the garage, and I sat in my seat with my hands folded and my mind quiet, and I was, at last, and for the first time, fully at rest. Thank you for staying with me all the way to that hallway. If you've ever spent years collecting proof for someone who would not look at it, I'd love to hear about it. Was there ever a moment the truth about you became impossible for your family to ignore? Did the recognition you waited for finally come, and did it feel the way you always thought it would? And if you had been standing in that summit hall, would you have reported the lieutenant, or would you have done what I did? Tell me in the comments. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and stay a while.